Welcome to Feminist Question Time. Today it's the 6th of February. Thank you so much for coming to Feminist Question Time today. It's an international feminist networking event. It's brought to you by Women's Human Rights Campaign, which is an international feminist organization promoting women's rights. We have a main focus on defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. You can find more information on the website womensdeclaration.com, where you will find our Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which has been signed by 14,556 people from 127 countries, and it's supported by 306 organizations. Thank you so much for coming. We're going to then go first to discuss with a Greek feminist to talk about the situation in Greece.
I started my work with Women's Human Rights Campaign back in the summer of 2020. I thought that it was very important, and it is very important, for Greek women to be further informed about the situation with trans activists and how the trans movement impacts women's rights. To start from the beginning, most feminists in Greece are mostly leaning towards liberal feminism. Very few feminist groups and organizations adopt a more radical perspective, while younger women tend to reject our views concerning the porn industry and the trans movement. So last fall, I tried to connect with other radical feminists in Greece who could help me with the promotion of WHRC. I contacted the group Heretic Feminism, which is the only openly radical Facebook page in Greece. Some of their members offered to help with the translation of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. So with their help and the help of a fellow radical feminist who's also a translator, we managed to finish the Greek translation of the declaration, which will be available on the site of WHRC in the following weeks. I also tried to contact other feminist groups who are against sex work and are against the silencing of women. The problem is that very few women organizations are ready to collide with the dominant liberal feminist views. Most of them are very hesitant, and while the trans agenda is relatively new to the country, even radical feminists fail to acknowledge the seriousness of their demands and how women's rights can be jeopardized if we adopt a gender-neutral agenda. All in all, I think there is a long way for Greece before more women learn about the true demands of the trans movement. I hope that during the next semester, I will be able, with my team, of course, to create a Greek web page for Women's Human Rights Campaign, and maybe, along with the help of my feminist sisters here in Greece, translate more radical feminist texts. Most women here are really brainwashed from the liberal opinions concerning feminism.
Yeah. What about trans activists' attempts to silence radical feminists in Greek social media?
Yeah, that's a very serious issue as well. So as I mentioned before, the liberal feminist view is the dominant one in Greece. There are many feminist pages that support the trans movement as well as the porn industry and sex work. Their pages mostly appear on Facebook, but some of them appear on separate blogs on the internet. In the past 2 or 3 years, I'd say there's a new trend of feminist pages that gather anonymous messages of women who have experienced sexism or male violence. And while there isn't a problem with these pages, some of these testimonies also come from trans women who blame the patriarchy for their misfortunes. In these pages, if there is any gender critical comment or criticism, the admins tend to step in immediately and ban the radical feminist who dared to speak her mind. I personally was banned from such a page simply for liking one gender critical comment. And on top of that, the previous month, the radical feminist page, Heretic Feminism, was targeted by another feminist page under the title Prostitutes of Mercy, which instructed their followers to report the only radical page in Greece for hate speech. Hopefully, they did not manage to ban the page, but there is still a serious threat against profiles and pages that promote gender critical and radical views. Another page that was attacked last summer was the feminist page Purple after defending their views against sex work on their page on Facebook. A With Fury followed their upload with many comments calling them swerves and radical feminists. Closing this question, I want to emphasize the similarity of such attacks against radical feminism in Greece to the ones we've seen abroad. It is noteworthy that liberal feminists and trans allies adopt the same autocratic methods of silencing, canceling, bullying, and terrorizing women with a different opinion. This is the situation, and I really hope it only gets better.
Thank you for telling us and explaining this.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about, you've told us there's a backlash concerning the upcoming revision of the family law in Greece. Can you explain that situation?
Yes, of course. This is a huge issue right now and a very serious one. So since last fall, there have been serious efforts from men's groups disguised as fathers' rights groups, to change the existing family law resulting from the feminist struggles back in the 80s. The most active group among them, which is supported by celebrities in the mass media here in Greece, is the one under the name Active Dads. Active dads claim that children need to spend equal amount of time with both parents to be happy, even after a divorce, and for that reason, they promote a new bill that will pass from the parliament the following season. This law will amend the existing family law by inserting the practice of a forced joint custody for all parents who have had a divorce or a breakup, which poses many problems for divorced mothers. So, first of all, you might ask, who are active dads and what are their arguments? Active dads are a group of high-salaried men, some of whom are lawyers, who are divorced and wish to have the custody of their children. They use clever arguments to convince the public in favor of their campaign. They claim that children who live with one of their parents suffer from the parental alienation syndrome. The theory of parental alienation syndrome was introduced back in the 80s by Richard Gardner, trying to explain why some children of divorced parents did not maintain good relations with the parent they did not live with. Gardner claimed that children were manipulated by the parent who had their custody to not maintain any contact with the visiting parent. We have to note that there were many critiques concerning the validity of Gardner's research and whether or not such cases constitute a syndrome. Another critique is that parental alienation syndrome may be used by abusers to ignore allegations of domestic and sexual abuse by redirecting the attention from the actual abuser, who is in most cases the divorced father, to the victim, who's usually the mother. So moving back to the group of active dads, another argument they use is that forced joint custody will further enhance equality between men and women by enabling women to work more hours and find full-time jobs. What they fail to acknowledge is the impact such legislation could have on abused women and their children. Another problem is that such a bill could further pauperize single mothers who depend on the alimony of their ex-husband to raise their children, since the upcoming bill of forced joint custody can impact the sum of the alimony divorced mothers receive. So the reason why the Greek feminist movement is against this law is because we know how such a practice could harm women and children who experience domestic violence and will be forced to continue living with their abuser. At this point, I have to add that there are no family courts in Greece responsible for the fast litigation of cases of domestic violence against women. Such cases usually take years to publish a final court decision, while women who cannot afford a lawyer might be discouraged from filing a complaint against their abuser. On top of that, joint custody already exists as a concept in the Greek law, but it requires both parties to be consensual about it, and it cannot be forcefully adopted. Personally, I am happy to tell you that the feminist movement in Greece has responded massively against this law, but it will be very hard to cancel this bill since activists maintain connections with political parties and the mass media. Hopefully, I will have good news to share with WHRC if the bill is cancelled in the following months.
Thank you so much. It's so great to hear your articulate explanation of what's going on, and it's as also worrying. So for the final question, we just have 3 minutes. And so if there is extra that you could perhaps you can put in the chat afterwards if there is more. But the question is this.
Okay.
Could you tell us about the violence against women and the highlighting of this issue in Greece, the Greek Me Too movement?
Yes. So I wanted to close this presentation concerning the situation in Greece with really fresh news. About 2 weeks ago, the Olympic champion of sailing, Sofia Bekatorou, accused the vice president of the Greek Sailing Federation of raping her 20 years ago while she was preparing to participate in the Olympics. She gave a detailed interview testifying that she lived in fear of filing an accusation against a rapist when she was younger, since her parents would remove her from the sport and she would have missed the Olympics and all her previous effort would have been in vain. Her testimony sparked a wave of Olympic champions and athletes sharing their experiences of sexual abuse in their work environment. Their confessions spread in the performing arts in Greece as multiple actresses are filing accusations against big actors and directors of the Greek theater. Many charges target university professors as well as famous journalists in the country. Most importantly, the whole country is talking about violence against women and sexual harassment in the workplace, which is very positive, as Greece experiences a similar movement to the American Me Too. On the downside, there are many misogynistic views spreading as well, questioning the truth behind those allegations, and they're trying to present the victims as irresponsible young women who initiated their abuse. In addition, many liberal feminists are trying to redirect the public opinion to the victims who aren't women by saying that also gay and straight men have been victims of sexual abuse or mobbing in the workplace. Although it is true that some men have been victims of workplace violence, this approach is dangerous because it erases the fact that women are in most cases victims of sexual harassment in the workplace, and that even when men suffer from the same problem, the perpetrator is almost always male. Closing my presentation, I'd like to say that even though there are many issues concerning the battle against male violence against women, I am optimistic, and I see that a number of organizations such as the public domain and universities adopt measures to counteract sexual harassment and possibly assist women who wish to file complaints in the future.
We are now going to go to lawyer specializing in human rights and the European Union law. Really interesting. An introduction to CEDAW, an outline of the original text mechanisms, and bringing us up to date with changes since 1979, explaining where the UN is now on CEDAW.
So let's just start right at the beginning, the United Nations system. This is 193 countries now, which is effectively every country in the world. And all the countries that are represented have equal representation at the UN General Assembly, and they create legal texts of all sorts, including treaties. Many of them, however, are strongly anti-women's rights, also children's rights, which is a new issue, and very strongly anti-LGB rights. So, for example, homosexuals can be punished by death in 10 countries, 73 countries criminalize homosexual activity, just to give a little sort of background. So there's a lot of countries in there that think they're interested in human rights in the UN, but actually practices are very different. I just point right at the beginning that trans issues have been slid onto the end of LGB rights very actively over the past 15 years or so. So this is a hot issue at the UN, but it very much always, you see, LGBT, okay? And it's just sort of come from nowhere. Campaigners, therefore, on these issues will be trying to get a whole package through to protect LGB rights and at the same time trans rights. So obviously for LGB people, that creates a bit of a difficulty. And just a couple of little bits of background, which I hope you can see. Within the UN, there's a huge organization that covers everything, and it's called UN Women. And you can go on their site and see about lots and lots of things. Also, I want to make clear, unfortunately, at the moment, I can't see this very easily. Conventions and treaties are legally binding in another way. If you see other documents with other titles like resolutions, they're not legally binding, and this is very important. So, of course, the UN kicked off in 1950 with the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and it was the first time we, real human beings, had any rights at the international level. It covers everybody. That's the way it talks, and everybody has equal rights. At the time, it declared that everybody had to be free of distinctions on race, color, sex, language, etc. Anybody who's looked at human rights things will see normally this list of things, and they are covering, therefore, in 1950, sex. It's also to bear in mind, well, how does this general human rights arrangement work? Human rights are to be universal and inalienable. You can't give them away voluntary. They're indivisible, they all work together. They work when they're interdependent and interrelated. You know, if you don't really have rights, proper rights and access to employment, you're not going to be able to operate any of the other human rights that you have. We need the package. So, countries have got to ensure that everybody in their country have their human rights, that the rule of law is enforced in their country. You can't, it was clear at the beginning, you can't remove human rights by saying there are cultural and religious ideas in our country which defeat this. Can't do that. And I dealt with the fact that they can't be voluntarily given away. And here we are again, it's better. Conventions and treaties are legally binding. Declarations, covenants, resolutions are not, okay? So, human rights have been developing. So at the UN level, at the moment now, there are 9 different conventions. Don't worry about reading this whole list and memorizing it or anything. But just to give you an idea, kicking off in 1969, a new convention came in, right up to the latest one, which is in fact 2010. So the international community has been increasing and improving human rights by looking at different sectors. And of course, this mimics, this is because different groups in society have developed a political voice and a better standing, and they've been able to push forward their concerns and get new texts developed. So of course, the most important one for women came in 1981, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. And so it's always called CEDAW. This covers women as a sex. That actually also includes the young ones, in other words, girls. So anybody who is of the female sex. Looking at this, you could also bear in mind later, again, the development of rights, children's rights came along. And there's a Convention on the Rights of the Child, 1990. Now that covers all children, male or female. The result of this, if you're a girl child, you have special rights under CEDAW, and you have special rights under the Convention on the Rights of the Child as well, okay? So you have to look into both texts if you're looking out for girl children. And right at the bottom, again, at the moment I can't see it, in none of these texts is there any mention of sexual orientation or gender identity in these treaties. So these conventions are all legally binding in a certain way. And what I'm going to say applies to them all, so it's useful to know that, although we'll now be focusing on CEDAW. Okay? So countries have signed up to all this, and there's a whole list of very useful human rights and principles there. Why don't we have them in our own laws immediately? Zack, as they say in Germany, or boom, or, you know, just like that. Well, because actually all these conventions, although they're legally binding, countries are agreeing legally to enter into a process to bring their human rights standards up to what is in these texts. They have got to change their own laws. The countries have got to change their own laws. They've got to change their own practices. And of course, this is a hugely complex and politically very difficult process. So that is why at the moment you can have 189 countries around the world who've signed up to CEDAW, but what happens with human rights for women in those countries differs hugely. And for example, there's no end date for this process, but it is, you're committing yourself to hopefully begin to a process. Some countries sign up and they have no intention at all of doing anything about it. We have to be realistic. Next, there's no Supreme Human Rights Court to go to globally. I simply state that as a fact, but obviously that would probably be a very useful thing. But you will hear these conventions mentioned because your judges in your national courts can use these principles if they want to. They're not compelled to, but they can. And often in countries where they're beginning to take women's rights more seriously, they will use them as part of their legal toolkit when they're deciding cases. They can say, no, there's a disputed area, but what did our country agree to at the UN? Well, when it ratified, signed the CEDAW Convention, it said it would be doing this. So I shall take that as a legal principle that I can now apply in my decision. So there is progress being made there. And also these conventions, because they're not so detailed, they are also more flexible, because they can, it's a basic principle, so you can apply it to new circumstances that come along. Okay. So how are they also being used? Well, the UN talks about treaty bodies for all these conventions. So for each convention, they've set up an international committee of independent experts with a big budget and a big department, and they are chasing, monitoring all the countries' implementation of these treaties. And so you would focus on the CEDAW committee, because basically they're called committees, and then the rest of the name is from the convention, torture convention, children's convention, etc. It'll have a committee. So CEDAW committee is for the women's rights one. And this, what they mainly do is this naughty step process, as I call it. Every 4 or 5 years, every country has to submit to the reporting process. So this committee looks in detail at your country and issues a public report on how you're doing. And so this is deemed to work through publicity and shame and giving people in the country a better idea of what's going on, providing information, swapping information across the world, putting on political pressure. And most importantly, the UN wants to talk to other organizations, NGOs, for example, and they are entitled to put in what are called shadow or alternative reports. So when your country is being looked at, an organization like this one, for example, can put in a report to the UN and say, well, here you're looking at this country, this is what we say is going on here, okay? And very often, obviously, the report that the country itself submits is very different from what the people who actually live in the country, the organizations in the country say. But again, this all brings publicity. And also these committees develop what are called general comments and recommendations about how their convention should be applied. And these are very useful to use and look at, but they are not legally binding.
So we're now moving on to Teresa Nevado. She's from Spain. She's the Secretary General of the Lobby Europeo de Mujeres in España, in Spain. So she's the European Women's Lobby in Spain, and she's going to present to us the position that the women's lobby, the Spanish women's lobby, have been taking in regards to gender identity in relation to the general European Union and Women's Lobby, and the work that she's been doing.
Soy la secretaria general del Lobby Europeo de Mujeres en España, que es una plataforma nacional que pertenece al European Women's Lobby. Explico primero brevemente qué es el European Women's Lobby, que es una organización umbrella, plataforma, que engloba a los 27 países de la Unión Europea, más unos países que no están en la Unión Europea, Turquía, Serbia, Macedonia del Norte, Islandia y Reino Unido, que salió de la Unión Europea, y a 19 grandes asociaciones de mujeres internacionales que también forman parte del European Women's Lobby. El Lobby Europeo de Mujeres en España es la plataforma nacional, solo hay una plataforma nacional en el European Women's Lobby, que englobamos al entorno de 15 asociaciones de mujeres, parte de las cuales son federaciones, con lo cual englobamos a un conjunto muy amplio de asociaciones de mujeres que tocan tareas muy distintas, desde presencia de mujeres en órganos de dirección de empresas, a mujeres rurales, a mujeres que trabajan específicamente contra la violencia o mujeres que trabajan en medios de comunicación. El European Women Lobby tiene en su Asamblea General un sistema para poder presentar mociones de urgencia. Tuvimos la última Asamblea General en septiembre del año pasado y el Lobby Europeo de Mujeres en España decidimos presentar una moción de urgencia ante la situación de cambios de leyes que estaban en marcha o se preveían en nuestro país España, cambiando sexo por identidad de género o difuminando el papel de las mujeres como sujeto jurídico en temas de igualdad. La moción que presentamos decía exactamente, voy a leer lo siguiente: 3 proyectos legislativos sobre libertad sexual, la protección de la infancia y la modificación de la Ley de Educación se discutirán en el Parlamento español en los próximos meses. Y todos ellos llevan una confusión entre sexo y género. Otros proyectos legislativos similares vendrán en breve. Ahora mismo está el proyecto de ley trans que se acaba de anunciar por el gobierno español. Quitar o desaparecer el concepto de sexo bajo el epígrafe de identidad de género tendrá un impacto negativo en las políticas de promoción de los derechos de la mujer, principalmente en 2 leyes fundamentales españolas, que son la Ley contra la Violencia de Género y la Ley de Igualdad. Este problema se da en España, pero no solo. Por tanto, se necesita una aclaración desde el movimiento feminista y desde el European Women Lobby con respecto a este tema. Presentamos la moción tiene que ser aprobada, obviamente. Para que se discuta en la Asamblea, en el Pleno, una moción, necesitas llevar 5 firmas de apoyo de miembros del European Women Lobby. Como éramos conscientes de que la situación era complicada porque nunca se había discutido este tema en el European Women Lobby, hicimos un gran esfuerzo por llevar muchas más firmas de apoyo y conseguimos no 5, sino 22. 22 de un total de 42 miembros que formamos parte del European Women Lobby. 42 miembros, lo que he contado antes. Posteriormente a nosotros, la plataforma portuguesa presentó una moción del mismo tipo, pero no dirigida a su gobierno, no de carácter interno, sino dirigida hacia la Comisión Europea por resoluciones que está tomando la Comisión Europea, digamos, en pro de la identidad de género y para hacer desaparecer el concepto sexo. Esta moción fue aprobada, las 2 mociones fueron aprobadas en la Asamblea General el 8 de septiembre del año pasado, con una mayoría sustancial. Tuvimos un 61% de votos afirmativos frente a un 17% de votos en contra y un 22% de abstenciones. La moción exigía en la aprobación que se enviara carta al Gobierno de España, a los grupos parlamentarios que tienen que aprobar, discutir y aprobar las propuestas de leyes, para aclararles cuál era la posición del European Women Lobby. Quiero recordar que el European Women Lobby es la organización europea reconocida como interlocutora en políticas de igualdad por el Parlamento Europeo, la Comisión Europea, etcétera, etcétera. Es una organización muy influyente para las políticas de igualdad en la Unión Europea y, derivado de ello, muy influyente en cada uno de los países que forman parte de la Unión Europea. Pasó el tiempo y vimos que nadie contestaba, no se ejecutaba la moción. Nosotras insistimos preguntando repetidamente cuándo se iba a ejecutar la moción, es decir, cuándo se mandaban las cartas al gobierno español y a los grupos parlamentarios. No tuvimos respuesta, hasta que finalmente, hace un mes y medio, 2 meses, vimos que el secretariado y el ejecutivo del European Women Lobby había convocado una BOAR, el órgano de dirección del European Women Lobby, para el 4 de febrero, hace 2 días, con un único tema: identidad de género. Solo ese tema y ninguna agenda en concreto. Insistimos e insistimos y finalmente tuvimos la información no clara ni claramente oficial de que el secretariado estaba planteando serios problemas ante el ejecutivo del European Women Lobby acerca de la conveniencia de estas mociones que, recuerdo, habían sido aprobadas en la Asamblea General, la conveniencia por discriminatorias, por ir contra la legalidad belga, por cuestiones variadas y diversas que no podíamos entender. Cuando se presentó el BOAR del pasado 4 de febrero, la idea que yo tengo y la idea que teníamos era un poco para echar abajo las mociones que habían sido aprobadas en la Asamblea General con claridad en la toma de posición acerca de, en esta disputa, el sexo como base de análisis de discriminaciones y desigualdades frente a la identidad de género, concepto vago y etéreo que no sabemos qué es lo que incluye. Decidimos, un conjunto de compañeras del European Women Lobby, parar ese Consejo de Administración, ese BOAR. Y para ello presentamos el 4 de febrero en el BOAR un punto del orden del día para discutir, para votar en contra de la agenda que estaba establecida en el BOAR, lo cual significaba que el BOAR no tenía sentido y desaparecía. Con un 63% de votos ganamos la votación. Por tanto, el BOAR no tuvo lugar de manera formal y se convirtió, porque lo planteamos nosotras, en una discusión abierta y libre entre las 42 personas que formamos parte del BOAR acerca de qué había sucedido con las mociones y acerca de, o colocando en el centro del debate, qué sucedía con el tema de identidad de género que se pretendía meter de manera oscura, de manera oculta en la discusión. Para que tengan ustedes una idea de cuál era la intención, en el orden del día, que finalmente no se aprobó, había una primera explicación de la carta del secretariado al BOAR sobre los males, discriminaciones, o no se sabe muy bien qué, que tenían las mociones aprobadas. La española se la he leído y lo pueden ustedes saber qué es lo que decía. Y además había la presencia de un abogado para explicar el contexto legal belga existente. En nuestra opinión, mi opinión, es que había un intento de confundir a las asistentes en el BOAR sobre la ilegalidad de un debate fundamental en el movimiento feminista bajo una apariencia de que era ilegal, que contraviene las leyes belgas, etcétera, etcétera. Como ya he dicho, conseguimos ganar y paramos el BOAR que estaba preparado. Y conseguimos empezar una discusión en el interior del BOAR que duró 3 horas o 4, una discusión franca y abierta acerca, primero, de lo que había sucedido para parar las mociones aprobadas en Asamblea General que como todo el mundo sabe es el órgano máximo de dirección de cualquier organización, y en segundo lugar para discutir el tema a fondo y ver que no estábamos equivocadas, que no estábamos a favor, ni estábamos engañadas, ni teníamos una confusión de conceptos. Sabíamos lo que queríamos aprobar y lo habíamos aprobado. Yo creo que este proceso último, en los últimos meses, en el European Women Lobby, ha sido muy, muy importante. Y el éxito obtenido ha sido muy, muy importante por dos factores que señalaré. El primer factor, porque impedimos una instalación, digamos, de unos sistemas poco democráticos de toma de decisiones en una organización que, de haber ganado, probablemente hubieran herido de muerte a la organización, al European Women Lobby, y desde luego le hubieran quitado legitimidad. Y en segundo lugar, más importante, tan o más importante que el primero, porque paramos en la plataforma de asociaciones de mujeres más importante de Europa una deriva, un riesgo cierto hacia avanzar hacia posiciones contrarias de verdad a las mujeres, contrarias a utilizar el sexo como base de análisis jurídico de cualquier discriminación y a favor de la identidad de género. Voy a terminar en un minuto. Quiero decir que ahora el debate está planteado con claridad en el European Women Lobby y que somos mayoría quienes estamos en la posición que estamos. Yo quiero terminar diciendo una cosa que es sencilla. No hay espacio pequeño ni hay actor irrelevante en una defensa de causas justas. El lobby europeo de mujeres en España no era un actor principal, ni siquiera particularmente influyente en el European Women Lobby. Pero tuvimos la valentía de presentar la moción, la tenacidad de no aceptar que no se ejecutara, la capacidad de explicar a nuestras compañeras, de las que me siento agradecida y orgullosa, la capacidad de explicarles que nos apoyaran. Y eso ha tenido un efecto muy superior al que pensábamos en el principio. Ha tenido un efecto enorme. Y eso creo que es una experiencia muy importante que quiero transmitirlas a todas ustedes. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Now we're going to go to our fifth speaker, Cara Dansky. She's a lawyer and coordinator of the Women's Human Rights Campaign Laws Group. She's from the USA and she's a fantastic speaker and has been promoting women's sex-based rights on a lot of TV programs recently. So you might have seen her clips. So welcome, Cara. So Cara is going to explain the CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women, and the plan for the Women's Human Rights Campaign parallel event, which will be happening in March. And then she'll also tell us about the US situation.
So this is the page for, this is the generic page for the NGO CSW. And this is the page that you can go to and you can learn all about what the CSW is and how you can get involved and, you know, read some of their resources. This is essentially a group of civic organizations that works with the UN on women's rights and women's issues. And you can, if you want, join. You can become a member by clicking on the membership button and they'll charge you $50 to do that. But you don't have to in order to get involved in the event that we are doing that Joe just described. So if you go to this page, ngocsw.org, you'll find where it brings you to the NGO CSW forum. So this is what we want. This is what we're doing. This is an event that happens annually, typically in person in New York. But because of course, not everyone can go to New York, they're doing it virtually this year. And they're reporting a tremendous amount of interest, which is really, really wonderful. And this is a fantastic opportunity for us to present the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. There will be thousands, tens of thousands of people there, I'm sure. So when you go to the forum page, right, this is the page that talks about the forum. And what you can do I have to say, they don't make it terribly easy to navigate all of this. But if I understand, this is being run by a very small staff and a team of volunteers. So they're doing their best, and they're asking for our patience, as we all navigate all of this. So if you scroll down to where I've gotten, you can click on register to become an advocate. That's what you want to do. And they've made it possible to do this for free. So this is great. So if you click on register to become an advocate, it will take you to this Eventbrite page, and you can go ahead and you just, you click on register, and it will send you an email, and it will give you login information. I'm not going to do that now because I'm already registered, but that's what you do. It's fairly straightforward. I will say that a few of us have had some trouble with the process, but most of us have been able to register successfully. Okay, so once you have registered and you get your login information, they will send you a link to this page, which is run by something called Pathable, which is a virtual platform. So once you log in, here's what you can do. You can go to schedule, and it will show you agenda and my agenda. And if you go to agenda and you go to Saturday, March 20th, which is the date of our event, you just click on the date, it will take you to Saturday. And then what you need to do is scroll down through all of these other events that are not our event. And when you get to 10 a.m. New York time, they do this all by New York time, you'll see our event. And this is Defending Women's Sex-Based Rights. You can click on it, and you can click on Reserve Spot, and that will reserve you a spot in our event. And you can all sort of play around in this site. There are messages, there are places for chatting. And so this is where you can come and hear our event. It's important to note there's no Zoom link for us to send. You have to register for this particular platform in order to get access to the event. And you have to navigate your way into this event and reserve your spot. So there won't be a link to send in advance. You have to just go at the day and time, the 20th of March at 10 a.m. New York time, reserve your spot. There will be a button, I believe it will be right about here, where Joe will start the meeting. And at that point, it will feel like a regular Zoom webinar. They've set it all up somehow technologically so that this virtual platform will sort of link in some fashion to Zoom. So it will feel like a regular Zoom webinar. So this is for the event on defending women's sex-based rights, and I hope we will all come to that. The other really interesting thing, though, for all of us to know is that we can, once we've registered for the platform, sign up to attend any of their events. And all you have to do in order to do that, let's say you decide that you want to go to this pre-recorded content on NGO CSW 65. You want to attend that event. All you have to do is click the plus sign on the event. And then what it does is it adds it to this thing called My Agenda. It looks like I'm actually already logged in, so that's good. So what this is showing is that I don't have any meetings on my agenda because I haven't clicked on any. But if I did, it would look like this. Let's say I want to go to this pre-recorded event. I click on it, then I go to my agenda, and there it shows me that I'm signed up to attend this event. And then what I can do, if I want to do it, I'm going to unschedule myself since I don't actually want to attend that event. What we can do then, because there's spaces to chat and message with other attendees, we can use that as an opportunity to promote the declaration as well. So we can link to the declaration in the message box. We can talk about the declaration. We can ask questions of other women from all over the world who are attending all of these various events. So that's just a brief overview. I hope you all get the opportunity to go ahead, register for the platform, reserve your spot in our scheduled event on defending women's sex-based rights, and go ahead and sign up for any other events that look interesting to you. There's a lot to talk about. There's a lot going on. It's going to be a really fantastic opportunity.
Now, Kari, you said that you can also tell us about the US situation. That would be really interesting to hear what's happening in the US.
Sure. So a couple things, I'll keep my screen share up for now. So as many people know, we recently had our newly elected president sign something called the Executive Order on Preventing and Combating Discrimination on the Basis of Gender Identity or Sexual Orientation. You can find it here. What this order did is basically two major things. It's important to note that this order in and of itself does not change existing law. So existing law has not been changed by this order. But what it does do is set out Section 1, this policy, and it's got several paragraphs talking about the importance, according to the Biden administration, of enshrining gender identity in law as a form of sex discrimination. And it does this deriving its reasoning on last summer's decision in Bostock versus Clayton County. And it does this in a very misleading way in a number of fashions, in part by suggesting that the reasoning of Bostock extends beyond the employment context. I don't want to go too into Bostock right now because we don't have time, but I will just say the Supreme Court last summer decided that it is illegal sex discrimination to discriminate against someone on the basis of their so-called transgender status. The Supreme Court, however, did not tell us what it might mean by transgender status. But in any event, we think that the Bostock decision was terrible for women and girls. But as bad as it was limited to the employment context. And this order takes it far beyond that for the purposes of administrative law. So that's the first thing it does, is it sets out this policy. And then it goes on. Section 2 is about enforcement. So there are 4 steps here. I won't go through all of them, but basically what this order does is it orders administrative agencies, this does not affect Congress, but administrative agencies to look at all of its policies and practices that address sex discrimination, and within 100 days to formulate a plan to revise their policies on sex discrimination to define sex to mean gender identity. So what are we doing about this? Because we have 100 days from the date of the order, which was the date of his inauguration, we have 100 days. So WHRC USA is forming a working group. We plan to talk with the agency heads to explain exactly why enshrining gender identity in the law is detrimental to women and girls, and using this as an opportunity to really promote the declaration in the United States government. And we really want them to when they formulate their plans, to take into consideration our needs and interests as women and girls. But beyond WHRC USA, women in the United States have had enough. After this order was issued, women got extremely fired up. Women have launched an event for March 8th, International Women's Day. It's called Women Picket DC. WHRC USA has endorsed this event. We are standing up. We have had it. Women have had it. So these are the organizations that have endorsed the event. And, if there's you can donate if you can. First of all, if you can come to Washington, D.C., if you're comfortable with that, we're going to follow COVID protocols. We're going to be safe. We're going to be peaceful. If you can come to Washington, D.C. and support this, that would be great. If you can't, please consider giving us a donation to cover the expenses. And of course, this event is promoting the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. So you're welcome to visit us at womenpicketdc.com. Women have had enough and we are fired up. Okay, beyond the Biden order, we're dealing with action in Congress. As many people will know, the House of Representatives passed the so-called Equality Act last summer. We anticipate that the so-called Equality Act will be reintroduced this year, probably as early as later this month. And so WHRC USA does not like that because the so-called Equality Act would essentially erase women and girls in the law. So we have come up with something called the Equality for All Act. And the working group that's working on the Biden order is also working on getting the Equality Act introduced before Congress. We are desperate to have a national conversation about what is actually going on here. So that's what's happening legislatively. Also, you need to know there is, well, I lost the link, but that's okay. There is a new working group just as of the past couple of days that announced that it is going to work to get introduced before Congress what it calls a so-called compromise on women's rights. And unfortunately, Martina Navratilova is very active in this effort. And essentially what this effort would do, it says that it compromises between women's rights and trans rights. And what it would do is both undermine women's sports, counter to Article 7 of the Declaration, and encourage the administration of puberty blockers in minors, counter to Article 9 of the Declaration. It does this by advocating for males to participate in women's sports so long as they have not undergone male puberty, which is essentially an encouragement of the administration of puberty blockers. So we're monitoring that situation. Beyond the federal government, we are dealing with an onslaught of state legislation. We have 17 states that are currently considering legislation to protect women's sports. This is great. It's absolutely fantastic, and we are wanting to be very active in that fight. Several more states have legislation in the works that has not yet been introduced. 2021 is going to be a very busy year. 11 states are considering legislation to regulate in some fashion the administration of puberty blockers on minors. WHRC USA has formed a working group to monitor all of these developments and submit written testimony wherever possible, explaining why allowing men to participate in women's sports is counter to both Article 1 and Article 7 of the Declaration, and explaining why the administration of puberty blockers to minors is counter to Article 9 of the Declaration. This will all be developing very quickly in the upcoming months. We've got our work cut out for us, and I will stop there. Thank you so much.